Everyone today. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Liz Schultz. I'm the SFMS Senior Operations Analyst. And we're excited that you could join us for this T-Code training. This is T-Code Basics. We do intend to have a more advanced training coming next year in 2025. But we've got a lot of information to cover. If you've got questions along the way, please put them in the chat. We'll try to address them in the questions section. We really want you to get some new information out of this. This is designed more for people that are newer to using T-codes, but we're going to be going over a lot of information. So even if you're pretty familiar with T-codes, there should be some information in here for you, even if it's just a refresher. So we'd love your feedback. Let us know how we're doing, because T-codes can be a pretty big topic. So we're going to start today with some general information. We're going to go through a lot of examples today, but want to start with kind of some basics on what a T-code is, how you get information about T-codes, and just some basic steps you follow when working with these T-codes. So let's start with some basics of what is a transaction code. So transaction codes, it's a 3-character code. It determines the accounting impact of financial transactions in R-stars. So I've already done it today. You've heard me refer to them as T-codes. They're also sometimes abbreviated as TC. It all means the same thing. It's all a transaction code in R-stars. So why do we use transaction codes in R-stars? They're really designed to simplify transaction entry. So anytime you're entering a transaction into the accounting system, you're going to be using a transaction code to make that entry. And it's doing all that dual accounting behind the scenes on the general ledger. So you only have to enter one entry, but it's going to be impacting 2 different general ledger accounts when you're doing that. So it's just kind of a shortcut to make sure that all of our general ledgers stay in balance and that transactions are entered in the system in a way that can be easily summarized for financial reporting. So the question comes up pretty frequently of how do you select the correct transaction code to use? Transaction codes are specific to R-stars. We have a lot of different T-codes that are available. So we're going to be talking about that today, of how do you find the correct T-code to use. You may already know if it's a transaction you routinely record. You can go back and see what has been used in the past. We've got T-codes that are really common and are used frequently. But if you ever wanted to know how did that T-code get determined? Why am I using this particular one for this entry? Or maybe you've got a new entry and you're not sure what T-code to use. That's what we want to talk about today. And really, it depends on what general ledger accounts need to be impacted and which comptroller objects need to be impacted. Those are 2 key pieces of information that'll really help you make sure you're using the correct T-code for your entry. And we will go over that information in more detail today. I do want to ask, did everybody, I want to make sure everybody has a copy of the slides for this presentation. We'll be presenting them. This information will be recorded. This training will be recorded and go up on our website. But we want to make sure you've got those. We also have 2 handouts that we sent. So if you don't have a copy of those, feel free to email Amber Nunnery. She's the organizer for this meeting, and we can make sure you have a copy of those. They will be posted on our website later, but we will be talking about those handouts a little bit today. All right, I'm seeing some thumbs up, so it looks like we've got people that received the materials. That's great. So let's talk a little bit more about selecting a transaction code. And really, it boils down to 4 basic steps. And we're going to follow all of these steps in our examples in this training. So in general, what you need to do to be able to find out the right T-code to use for your entry is the first step is you need to identify the type of transaction you want to report. Once you understand what you need to be entering, what information needs to be recorded in that accounting system, then you can do the steps of narrowing down T-codes. Sometimes you'll have all that information readily available. Sometimes you might need to ask more questions within your agency of what is the impact of this transaction. Reach out to other resources in your agency if you need more information. Your SFMS analyst can also be a good resource if you need help understanding some of that information. Step 2 is to use the research tools that we are going to cover in today's training to help you narrow down your T-code options. As I mentioned, we have a lot of different T-codes available. So the second step is really kind of figuring out what category of transaction are you trying to record to narrow down that list so you don't have to look through every single one. Step 3 is then picking that transaction code that's the best fit for your transaction. So oftentimes you may find several different T-codes that look like they could work. So how do you determine which one is the best one to use for your entry? And then the final step is actually making sure you have all the required coding and the correct user class security to make the entry. So we'll be looking at the T-codes. Different T-codes may require different fields to be entered with them. So you want to make sure before inputting the information into the accounting system that you have all of those required fields that need to be completed and that you have the right security. User classes are designed in RStars to control security to the system, and they determine what transactions you're able to enter. So making sure if you picked a T-code, is it a T-code you have the user class security to enter? Maybe somebody else in your agency needs to enter it. Maybe you need to use a different T-code if that's not something that an agency would have access to. So those are the 4 basic steps. We're going to be revisiting them quite a few times in the examples for today's training. So when we talk about step 1, let's drill into these a little bit more to give you some more detail. Identifying the type of transaction. You want to know, is this revenue to the agency? Is this an expenditure? Is this a transfer? What are you trying to record into the accounting system? What activity is this? We do have on this slide, there is a link to the Oregon Accounting Manual. There's a specific section that kind of gives you some information on the different types of categories of transactions when you're trying to figure out what sort of T-code to use. This section on the link here, we've got it displayed on the right of the slide, shows, we've got budgetary type transactions, we've got revenue transactions, we've got encumbrances and expenditures, all the different types of categories. And this slide is also helpful because it lets you know the numbering sequence of T-codes. So if it's a budget type transaction, those T-codes tend to start with a 0. Revenue T-codes tend to start with a 1. Expenditures, encumbrances start with a 2. You may find some exceptions to some of these, but in general, if you're looking at these different categories, this is one way you can kind of narrow down the T-codes you want to focus on. And this gives you an idea of all the different types of T-codes we have in the system. We try to set up T-codes for every possible scenario an agency may encounter. So you're going to see a lot of T-codes on that list that you may never need to use. Maybe only certain agencies use those T-codes. So there's going to be some that are more common across the state, and those more common ones are the ones we're going to cover in the examples today, at least a few of them. But really the important thing to know is there are a lot of different T-codes out there for a lot of different purposes. We're not going to have time to go through all of them in these trainings, but we're going to talk about some of them. And if you have questions on other ones or you're trying to record something unusual, you can reach out to your SFMS analyst and we can kind of help you navigate some of that. So that's the step of identifying the type of transaction. Continuing on, what general ledger accounts to use. With T-codes, you're not having to enter the general ledger account most of the time. The T-code is doing that for you. But if you understand those general ledger accounts, it really helps narrow down what T-code you need for the entry. We do have a list linked here from the Oregon Accounting Manual. And if you have a moment, If you haven't looked at this section of the Oregon Accounting Manual in the past, I would really encourage you to do that. It'll get you more familiar with the chart of the accounts for the state. So this OAM 60.10.00 will have a list of all the different general ledger accounts across the state with definitions of what is included in there. Not every agency is going to use all of those GL accounts. It's designed to be covering everything statewide, but this is a really helpful resource just to understand what those GL accounts mean. Every T code is going to reference at least 2 different general ledger accounts. So if you ever have a question on what a general ledger account is, or if you're looking at a T code and you can see it referencing certain GLs, you can go to this OAM and look up the definition and get some more information on what that represents. We also have a link on this slide to our SFMS website to another resource. We have a listing of each general ledger account that shows how it rolls up to financial reporting. So if you like to have that kind of big picture view of you're inputting this transaction, it's hitting this general ledger account, but how does that roll up all the way to the state financial statements? This GL list will give you that information. So you can see, does it roll up as a current asset or non-current asset? If you prefer to have that perspective from kind of the financial reporting side, this is a good resource to take a look at. In addition, just kind of tying it back to our STARS accounting system, you can look up individual GL accounts on what's called the D31 profile. You can enter in a 4-digit GL account, and you can see the GL account title and get a little bit more information about it. So there's a lot of different resources available to give you more information about the general ledger accounts. Also have comptroller objects. When you're recording your entry, you may want to determine what comp object you need to put on that transaction. So we previously talked about general ledger accounts. That's going to determine how things show up on your balance sheet reports. If you're familiar with the DAPR 6620, the agency balance sheet, those GL accounts are what's going to be appearing on that report. When we talk about comptroller objects, that's what's determining what's going to appear on your agency operating statement as current year revenue, current year expenditures. So determining what comptroller object you need to use on your transaction. Is this an expenditure? Is it for office supplies? Is it for a travel reimbursement? It's those type of categories. Not every T code is going to require you use a comptroller object on your entry if it's only impacting the balance sheet. If it's not current year activity, current year revenue, expenditures, or transfers, that T code won't require a comptroller object. So you're not always going to have one on your entry, but most entries, if it's current year activity, are going to require that. So we do, again, have a listing in the Oregon Accounting Manual of all the different comptroller objects across the state with definitions. So that's another good one to look at just to see all of the different categories we have across the state that'll roll up to financial reporting. We, again, have a similar list on our SFMS website showing how each of those comptroller objects roll up for financial reporting. So you can take a look if you want that big picture view to kind of understand how things are feeding into the financial statements for the state. One really important thing to note, in our STARS accounting system, we have agency objects and comptroller objects. Comptroller objects are the statewide level, but a lot of agencies, I think the majority of agencies in the state have elected to use agency objects just to provide a lower level of tracking activity. So when you're entering a transaction, you might not even enter the comp object. You may just enter the agency object. Agency objects are set up by the agency on the D11 profile. And anytime an agency object is set up, it will point to a specific comptroller object. So you can look up that agency object on the D11 profile. You'll see a field for a comp object. And then you can look up that comp object in the OAM and get a definition of it. So the comp objects are on the D10 profile, but just an important note, we're talking about comptroller object today, the statewide level. But in your agencies, you may be using agency object, so you may need to just go out to that D11 profile, see what comp object that rolls up to kind of translate that into the comptroller object statewide level. So moving on to our second step. First step was identifying the type of transaction, really understanding those general ledger accounts and comptroller objects that may be needed for your entry. Now you need to figure out what research tools you can use to narrow down your options. And there's a lot of links, there's a lot of information on this slide. We'll be touching on all of these, but in our examples, we'll go through exactly how you would do this, but those research tools available for you for general ledger accounts, again, it's the Oregon Accounting Manual. It's that general ledger list that's on our SFMS website. You can look up general ledger accounts on the G31 profile. If you use OB to run queries, you can run queries of the general ledger account profiles if that's your preferred method. So there's a lot of different ways to get to that information, depending on what you're most comfortable with using. For comp objects, same type of thing. We've got the Oregon Accounting Manual to look up those definitions, that complete list of comp objects where you can see how they'll roll up for financial reporting. You can look them up on the D10 profile, or if you like to use OB, you can query that information as well. Another resource we'll be talking about frequently in today's training, and we'll be showing screen prints from it as well, is the T-code spreadsheet. We've got a link to it here. This spreadsheet that's on our website contains all the information that can be found on the RSTARS 28A and 28B profiles. So the 28A and 28B are what T-code information is managed on in RSTARS. So we'll be talking about those profiles. We've got all of those different fields and information summarized on that spreadsheet. So we'll be going over this quite a bit today. You can run an OB query to look at that information too. We also have a report that will show an example of where you can get a listing of all the different T-codes. So again, a lot of different ways to get the same information. We're going to be focusing on that transaction spreadsheet today in our examples, but there are other ways to get information depending on how your agency works or what resources you've used in the past. For using the T-code spreadsheet, again, I mentioned before, you may already know what T-code to use for your entry if it's something that you routinely record, so you don't always have to go through all of these steps in detail. We'll be walking through this to kind of give you an example of how to do that. But if you're not sure what T-code to use, or you just want to verify that you do have the right one, there's a few different tools you can use. The transaction code spreadsheet, we've got a link to it here directly to the spreadsheet on the bottom of the slide. On the right-hand side, you can also navigate it to it from our website on our main page for the SFMS website. It's that link that's in orange down there, the transaction codes. If you click on that, that will take you to the transaction code spreadsheet also. So if you want to follow along, feel free to open up that T-code spreadsheet. We have a link to it in the slides. Handout number 2 that we provided with the presentation materials includes links to all the different things that we're mentioning during the training today, just kind of on one page, so you can have that information at your fingertips. If you've got a second screen, feel free to open that up and kind of follow along, especially when we get to our examples. If you didn't get a copy of those handouts or slides, send a message to Amber Nunnery, and she can get you a copy of that information. All right, so if you open up that transaction code spreadsheet, it may take a minute to open up. It's a pretty large spreadsheet. It will open to a background tab that just gives you some basics, kind of similar to the information I went over this morning on what T-codes are and what different resources are available. The tab that one of the tabs we're going to be really focusing on is the second tab of that spreadsheet. It's called List of T-Codes, 28A and 28B. That spreadsheet has a list of all our T-codes. It has all of the different fields that you would find on the 28A and B profiles. So you can search for the information that you need a little bit easier. And we did make an improvement to this spreadsheet over the past 2 years to make it easier for you to try to find exactly what you need when you're searching for a T-code. If you open this up, there'll be 2 yellow boxes in the top left that will allow you to search by GL and or search by comp object. So if you know the GL you want to hit, you know the comp object you want to hit, you can put that information in there and you can filter this spreadsheet to only show the T-codes that allow those, to give you kind of an abbreviated list so you don't have to look through everything. Let's see, we've got some comments about a link to this spreadsheet. On slide 11, there's going to be a link here with the T-code spreadsheet that you can follow. Amber, I don't know if you could maybe copy and paste that link into the chat for people so they can get a copy of that.
I can do that, yeah.
Thank you, Amber. Yeah, we didn't provide a handout to the T-code spreadsheet. We just have a link. It is available on our website. So we've also got at the bottom slide 11 here. So you can input the GL and comp object you're interested in using for your entry. You want to then filter to make sure that the GL allowed and comp object allowed columns are set to true to get that abbreviated list. So I've got an example here. In this case, you know, I want to, let's say for fiscal year end, I want to accrue some revenue. So I've already done my step 1 to determine the GL I want to use is 3105. That's for accrued revenue or financial statement accruals. And I also want to use comp object 0300 for federal revenue. So I've done that pre-work. I know, I don't know what T-code I need to use, but I know that's the GL and comp object I want to use. I can input both of those in the spreadsheet. I can go to the column for GL allowed and filter it to values that equal true. I'll do the same for the comp object allowed equals true. And then I will have a shortened list of T-codes I can look at so I can kind of determine what T-code options are available to me. So that we hope this is a helpful tool to kind of make it easier when you are trying to search for comp object or for T-codes based on the GL and comp object. If you open up that spreadsheet, you'll see we have a really long list. So this just kind of shortens the time it will take to find the right one. Just a reminder, remember to remove those filters. So we've got the GL allowed, comp object allowed. We've set the filters to equal to true. If you're going to do another search for another GL or comp object, make sure to clear that out just so that you're getting accurate results for your search. So we will, again, continue to use this spreadsheet in future examples in this morning's training. The other resource that I mentioned is the DAFQ A010 report. If you like to use reports, if you prefer to have kind of a PDF listing of all of the T-codes instead of using the spreadsheet, you can order this report on the 91 screen. These screen prints might be a little bit small, but they kind of give you an idea of what you need to do. You would order this report on the 91 screen. We have an example on the left of what that would look like. You can order it any weekday, and then the report would be available for you to pull down from the PDF reports website the following morning. It'll list in the left-hand columns the GL account, the GL account title, and then the T-codes that use that GL account. So if you're interested in using this report, you know, and you need some help ordering it, reach out to your SFMS analyst. We can help you with that. We also have a report training coming up next month. So you'll see some information coming about that soon. So if you're interested in learning how to order reports from RStars, I encourage you to sign up for that training as well, because we'll go over it in more detail there. So what happens if you can't find a T code? So most of the time, when you'll see in our examples, when we get to step 2, we're going to find multiple different T codes that might work that we're going to need to look through. Now, if you ever encounter a situation where you're looking at that T code spreadsheet and you can't find any T code that does what you want to do, there's some things to kind of think through in that scenario, because that should be an uncommon scenario. We have a lot of T codes. Pretty much any scenario an agency is going to run into, there's already a T code set up for that. So if you're running into that situation, go back, confirm your understanding of the desired end result for that transaction. Are you looking at the right GLs? Are you looking at the right objects? Make sure you've got all that information about your entry. If you've already confirmed that, you've checked and that information is right, the other thing to consider is you might need to use more than one T code. Maybe there isn't one T code that will get you to where you want to be, but maybe you can make 2 entries to get to that desired end result. So keep that in mind. If you're not seeing one T code that'll do it, maybe it's a combination of 2. In our examples today, we're going to talk a little bit about system generated entries. There are certain T codes that when you enter them, another system generated entry will happen once certain conditions are met. So a common example, we're going to talk about it this morning, is for deposits. When you've got a deposit that's listed on the RSTARS 13 screen, you make an entry to record that deposit in SFMA. And once it reconciles with Treasury, it'll create a system generated T code 332. Just to say this is no longer an unreconciled deposit. It moves it over to cash on deposit. And that's a system generated entry. So when we go through our examples, we'll kind of talk about that. But that can be something to think through when deciding what T code you need to use, and what will that T code do? Will it generate another system generated entry? So we'll talk about examples of that today. And if you're still kind of stuck, reach out to others in your agency. Others may have dealt with this types of situation before. They may know what T code should be used. They may be able to give you some guidance, or ask your SFMS support analyst. We can help provide information on that if you're not finding a T code that's going to meet your needs for the entry. Step 3, kind of returning to our steps here, is picking the T code that is the best fit. So most of the time, I mentioned you'll filter down that T code spreadsheet. You might have several different T code options to choose from. And now it's just determining which one is the correct one for your entry. So we have the T code titles, which give you kind of information on what that T code is trying to do. We also have the T code descriptions on the 28B profile that provide kind of more of an explanation of how that T code should be used. So that information is really good on narrowing down which is the correct T code you want to use for your entry. Make sure that the T code that you're looking at is in active status. We do have T codes that are in inactive status. You won't be able to make an entry with a T code that's in an inactive status. So you might want to make sure when you're looking at that 28A profile that the status code is equal to A. We also have that as a column you can filter in the spreadsheet, so you can just look at active T codes. If you don't know who your SFMS support analyst is, others in your agency may know, you can look that information up on the RSTARS 90 screen, so 90, and then type in the word news, NEWS, as the keyword. And page 5 will show you agency numbers by analysts. Also feel free to reach out. You can send an email. I can let you know if you're not sure who your analyst is, who it is. It's either going to be Maria Berglund or Scott Wood, who's going to be presenting today. All right. So we're going to be talking about the 28A profile in today's training. And this handout 1, I'm not going to go over in handout 1 in full detail, but it's a really useful resource. We wanted to make sure everybody had a copy of this. if you look at the 28A profile and the 28B profile in our system, there's a lot of fields on there. And it's not necessarily intuitive on what all those different indicators mean. There's a lot of information on those profiles. So the handout that we provided with today's training, we'll post it up on our website as well, will tell you what all those different fields mean and what those indicators mean. So it is a really handy reference material. I use it all the time to kind of give you more information on what you can find on that profile. So we have information, the 28A profile, we've broken it up into 4 different sections on that handout. At the top of the profile, you have what's called the general ledger posting segment. It'll tell you which general ledger accounts are going to be impacted by this transaction. We also have the transaction edit indicator segment. This is the section that tells you what fields are required for that T code. Does it require you use a comp object or not? Does it require a vendor number? Does it require a due date? Those types of indicators are in that second section as shown on the handout. We also have the special indicators segment. This gives more information kind of on the system processing side. It may not be as useful to you when you're trying to figure out which T code to use, but it controls, what order does this post in the nightly batch cycle? It might tell you if there are system generated entries that are going to occur as a result of that T code. If I'm reporting a year-end accrual, it'll tell me if it's going to auto reverse that. So there's some additional information in that special indicator segment that just control how that T code is going to process in the system. The final section, kind of the bottom half of the 28A screen, is the file posting indicator segment. And this determines which financial table the system is going to post transactions to. So on this slide, we kind of have some information here with references to a lot of RStars screens. If you use, these are different RStars financial inquiry screens. So this section will tell you, will this T code post to that screen? So the document financial table is the RStars 64 screen. That's used for invoices. We're going to talk about that a little bit later today. This will tell you, is the transaction I'm posting, this invoice, is it going to post to the 64 screen or not? It'll tell you if it's going to post to the appropriation, the 62 screen. Is it going to impact your appropriation and allotment with this entry? Is it going to reduce your overall budget? We have the agency budget table, that's the 61 screen, whether or not it posts there, whether it impacts cash. The 63 screen, is this transaction going to reduce your cash? And then we have the grant table and the project table. If your agency uses grant numbers or project numbers, we have inquiry screens, 66 and the 80 screen. It'll tell you if that T code posts there. So that can be helpful sometimes when you're looking at different T codes and what they do. Are they going to post to these different tables or not? Sorry, skipped a slide there. So what information is on the 28B profile? So the 28B has a little bit less information as the 28A, but it's also included in that handout 1 with definitions. So the 28A will have the description for the T code. There's usually a lot of good information in there. It will also list which GLs will be allowed. Certain T codes will allow you to input a GL with your entry. If that's the case, the 28B screen will show all the GLs that you can input with that T code. If the T code allows a comp object, it will list all the comp objects or the range of comp objects that are allowed with that T code. It'll also tell you what document types or document prefixes can be used with the T code. Is it a cash receipt? It needs to start with CR. Is it an accounts receivable? It needs to start with AR. That information is on the 28B, as well as what batch types you can use with the T code. So some information on the 28B will help you prepare your batch entry to make sure you're using the right document numbers, you're using the right batch type for that. So look at the 28A and B profiles to find more about the T code. So that tends to be step 3. We've narrowed down our list, and now we're taking a closer look at those specific T codes to see which one's going to be the best fit. So again, pay attention to the T code titles, the descriptions, the transaction edit indicators for what fields are required, and the file posting indicators for what tables that T code will post to. The final step is making sure you have the required coding and the correct user class. So you can look at the 28A profile, find out which fields are going to be required. That's going to be the minimum. Your agency may have more that you need to enter. You know, maybe you're tracking this for a project number or a grant number. The 28A profile will show you the minimum of what needs to be entered with that T code, but there may be things specific to your agency. You might need to enter an index. Not all agencies use that, so just kind of being aware what you need to have as required coding on the transaction. The 28B will tell you the document types and batch types you need to use. And then your user class will indicate whether or not you have the appropriate security in RStars. We'll go through this later today, but you can use that T-code spreadsheet to help you find out what user classes are allowed with each T-code as well. So you can make sure that you have the security to make that entry. So let's look at kind of an example of that. RStars, our system access is all managed through user classes. So each agency will have an agency security officer. That's the person in your agency that's been designated to manage security. They're the ones that request access through SARS system security. They can help answer questions about security or who in your agency has certain types of security. All of this information on what T codes are allowed by a specific user class is stored in RStars on the D66 profile, but we've put that information into our T code spreadsheet so you can easily find what user classes you need to use. So if you're looking at that T code spreadsheet, we have a tab called List of User Classes. And again, we have a yellow box up at the top left-hand corner where you can type in the T code, and then you can filter T code allowed, set it to true, and you can see all user classes that can use that T code. So that's a helpful resource to kind of figure out what user class you may need to use. So going back to our previous example, where we were going to be accruing federal revenue for fiscal year end, I found out I needed to use T code 436 to do that by going through those prior steps. I can put that T code in that box. I can update my filter on the T code allowed and say equal to true. And then I can have a list of the different user classes that can enter that T code, and I can compare it against what user classes I have and see which one I can use to make that entry. Pay attention to the user class titles. We do have user classes that may only be used by interfaces or may only be for central access. So, you know, you may see user classes on there that an agency can't request. So this will just give you the list that you can compare and see if you have a user class to be able to make that entry. So that was a lot for general information. And we have the handout, and I didn't go through that, and I referred you to a lot of links. Again, we're going to be going through examples, following those same steps, using those same resources. So I don't expect you to have absorbed all of that information. We just want to make sure that you have access to it, you know where to find it, and we are going to be continuing to talk about it through the next sections. So I want to pause. If you've got questions, please enter them in the chat. I think I may have answered some along the way. Amber, did we have any other questions that you see that I did not address?
I don't see any more. If anybody didn't get the handouts that I missed, I got several emails, and if they just ask me again, I know one person said they didn't get it, and so just want to make sure we got everyone.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right, we're gonna, I'm not seeing any questions. If you think of something along the way, feel free to put it in the chat. I am going to now turn it over to Scott Wood, and we're going to go through our first example area of deposits.
Thank you very much, Liz. Happy to be here. My name's Scott Wood. I am the SFMS analyst for about half of your agencies, and today we're going to be talking about deposits. First and foremost, on the most basic level, most deposit transactions are entered manually with GL0065 reconciled on the 13 screen by Treasury, and SFMA generates an entry to move them to GL0070. We do have suspense accounts that we will talk about in more detail at a later date, but that's more part of our advanced training instead. For what you need to know, for this section, we are going to be mostly focusing on GL0065 unreconciled deposit and GL0070 cash on deposit with treasurer. For now, let's look at this example. Your agency has received cash. How will you record it in RStars? To identify the deposit transaction you want to record, or you have two questions you need to answer. What is the purpose of the cash transaction, and what comptroller object should you use? Like, is it revenue earned by the agency? Is it a refund of expenditure or receipt of investment funds? This will tell you which GL you need to record it in. And from there, we can go into OAM 630, which is also a link in your quick links guide to determine the proper comptroller object. Our examples for this section will be recording agency revenue, recording unidentified receipts, correcting unidentified receipts, and recording treasury fees. So let's say your agency charges fees as a normal part of operations. Since these are collected by cash or by check and are deposited daily, RStars will not establish an invoice for this activity. Therefore, you will have a deposit listed on the 13 screen that needs to be reconciled. What type of transaction do you want to record? Or we'll need to look up GL accounts and comptroller objects first and foremost. If you're not sure of the normal balance for a specific GL account, you can find, oh, sorry, wrong note. Oh, as it's on the 13 screen, we want to record this activity against GL0065 unreconciled deposit. Once we record that, the system will automatically debit GL00770 and credit GL0065, which means we need an entry that debits its unreconciled deposit 0065 and credits our fees. Since our fees are considered revenue, we will want to use GL 3100 revenue control cash. Simple as that. For the comp object, meanwhile, OAM has various categories for licenses and fees, but we need to pick the one that best describes this activity. You set 02112 other business license and fees seems nondescript enough for our example. Well, let's use that. Our next step will be finding the T-code. We can do this by opening up the T-code spreadsheet that Liz mentioned earlier and plugging in RGL and comp objects into those fields, as seen here. Here, you will plug in GL0065 onto the search for GL field and 0212 onto the search for comp object. Set both of these filters to true, and we will have 10 different and T codes for further review. Our next step is just pick the best T code. We don't want the T codes that are inactive status. I mean, are in inactive status. So we can filter those out, but for 10 T codes we won't need to. So far, receipt of revenue not accrued looks like our best bet. It hits GL 0065, 5 credits GL 3100, and the description most matches is our example. Well, with that, to confirm, we'll need to log into RStars and review the 8A screen. Looking at the transaction edit indicators, we can see if this T code will work for our purposes. Anything with an I in the indicator means the input is required. R means input or lookup is required. So if it has an I or an R, we need some kind of input or lookup on it. N means not allowed, so whatever has an N right next to it, we can't do it with this T code. And blank means optional, so from this we can see that a comp object is required. So it's a good thing we got that. And based on the title of the T code in the 28A screen, we can confirm that this is the one we want to use. Press F6 from the 28A screen to go to the 28B screen. This will give you valid batch types and document types for this T code to help prepare the entry. Often you'll find a reference to another T code in this description, as you can see here with T code 332, which will be automatically generated once we reconcile this T code. So our next step will be making the entry. Before making the entry, we need to make sure we have all the required coding. Our pair of 28 screens can get us 90% there, but for recording a deposit, we will still need an agency code 3. The agency code 3 is typically looked up by the 26 XPCA profile and should align with the account number on the 13 screen. I mean, it will not reconcile unless the deposit entry matches the information on the 13 screen. I mean, you can find more information in the deposit reconciliation and document provided by Treasury. Once we have all the necessary coding to make the entry, we need to make sure we have the correct user class. That's if you'll tab over to the user class tab on your RTC spreadsheet, you'll be able to look up all the different user classes used by TC190. We compare our results against the user classes you have to determine if you have the correct access to make this entry and go from there. And once all is said and done with this entry, you will find it's simply moving an unreconciled deposit to cast on deposit with Treasury. And we want to make sure we have another note of this, is once you make the T code 190 entry, it'll automatically make an entry for 332. That's not a big deal with this entry because we only inputted a T code 190, but will become a bigger issue once we get into correcting deposits, because we'll need to look at T code 332 instead of T code 190 for the correction. So now we have to Now we have a deposit waiting on the 13 screen, but we don't know, how to record the deposit and what fiscal month. We don't know how to record the deposit, and the fiscal month will close before backup arrives. What do we do now, considering we don't have all the information to record this deposit? And it's already on your bank statement, and we need to record in R stars. Well, it's in screen 13. We need to record the activity against GL065. That's a given. Once the deposit reconciles with Treasury, it'll generate AT code 332, so move the amount from GL0065 to 0070, which means we will need to debit at GL0065. So the big question is, what GL do we need to credit, and what comp object do we need to use? I understand there's a question in chat, but I will hold off on that until later. So, we need to, let's look at the T-code spreadsheet to narrow down on our examples. Unfortunately, searching for T-codes by IGL 0065 gives a few too many results. You will have 50 T-codes to choose from. To narrow down this list, let's filter by this active status code and filter out only the T-codes that are active in the system. Even so, it's still a lot of T-codes to look at. Let's start looking at those T-code titles to see which one matches what we need. Record unidentified receipt might be an option, but we'll need to do some more digging. So, let's see. The cred for this entry would be GL0060. Let's look up that definition. Identified cash receipt in the OAM. Not exactly what we're looking for. But it's a step in the right direction. And let's check 28A to be sure this is the T-code we need. And we can see that no comp object is required, which is good because we don't know the comp object that we'll need for this entry anyway, so it works out in our favor. Let's press F6 to go to the 28B screen and look at the description. And it's for our deposits reconciled with Treasury when the cash source is unknown. This is exactly what we need right now. We found the T-code quickly in this example, but there may be some additional steps that we need to go through. So I apologize for this being quick, but it is a presentation. And let's see which user class we need to make the entry with. This is still a deposit, and we'll still need an agency code 3 in order to reconcile it. But we can worry about that once we get to this in real life. Let's move on to the user class. So, not that many choices to choose from. I see that we have options for cash receipt card, ARC full revenue cycle, and program manager's extended authority. You figure out which one applies to you for the situation, and you will be able to use it at no problem. At the end of the day, our results moved the amount from unreconciled deposit to cash on deposit with Treasury while still leaving in this undistributed cash receipt. We now know how to move deposits from unreconciled deposit into cash without knowing the exact details of the cash source. This will be a very helpful tool for everyone. However, everything comes due, and in this example, we received our requested backup after the month closed. So we'll need to clear the unidentified receipt balance and reclassify it to revenue. What is our first step? That is, we need to pick a GL account, and in this case, we will need to pick a comp object. Unfortunately, the deposit has already reconciled on the RStars 13 screen, and the balance will most likely be sitting in GL00070 rather than in 0065 if reconciled. Note, if it is unreconciled, it will still be sitting in 0065. Our goal is to move reconciled cash out of D23 Fund A, credit GL0070, and into D23 Fund B, debit GL0070. Our TC151 entry create a credit balance in GL0060 in Fund A that we want to clear by crediting GL3100 in Fund B. So, we didn't use a comp object for the 151 entry. We won't need one to clear the balances in Fund A. However, we will need a comp object for the Fund B entry. Let's assume that the revenue is similar to that from example 1 and use comp object 0212 other business licenses fees. Yes. For finding a T code, we need this end result of D23 Fund A credit GL70 and debit GL60 with no comp object. And then we need D23 Fund B debit GL70 and credit GL3100 with comp object X0212. This is going to be a bit more involved. Also, it is a good thing we have a decision tree involved with this process. Please open up handout number 2 and click on the decision tree document and under the deposit section. And this makes things so much simpler. There are 3 questions and we can narrow down on everything. And we have to ask, has the deposit reconciled on the 13 screen? Is the deposit in the correct D23 fund? And is the T code correct? The answers are yes, no, no. And so, we can look in this little box to determine and what to do next. It's going to be 2 steps, so bear with me. We'll need to look at the deposit reconciliation T-code matrix table as well. Well, this gives an idea of what you need to do given in your original T-code and the T-code you need to change the D23 fund with. So, it says use TC pair 496/497, then and use 151R with TC190. If you need to correct T codes between different D23 funds, first use the BT T codes, then use the deposit T codes. The deposit T codes must be entered in the same batch with the same deposit number, or else we will not be able to reconcile all this. Based on the matrix, we will need to use the TC pair 496, 497 to move the activity to the correct D23 fund. And as I stated before, use TC151R and TC90 to correct the GL accounts and assign comp object 0212. We'll skip up looking at the 28A and B screens for brevity's sake and searching for UC. The needed UC for these transactions is UC E29. And as you can see, this process is a lot more involved on the D23 Fund A side. We moved everything out of undistributed cash receipt and completely cleared out cash on deposit with Treasury, whereas on the Fund B side, we moved everything to cash on deposit and revenue cash control. This is just one of those things you'll have to do once you're dealing with unidentified deposit. We can't have everything sitting on the account without figuring out where it goes to. So you're probably wondering, why can't we just use 151R and 190? Well, if the deposit is already reconciled, it'll leave two GL0065 balances, one debit and one credit that will never clear. And this is where I have to come in and say, hey, these balances haven't cleared. Here's the correcting entry I need you to do to make sure you get your money. So, for recording treasury fees, let me see here. I have to ask, do we have time for a break, or should we keep going?
Scott, I think we do have time, so you can kind of walk through this example, and then we can, if people want to take I think we can do a 10-minute break, and then if people want to, are so excited about T codes that they want to try to go through this example before we share the answer, we can do that. So yeah, I'd say kind of walk through the example of this slide, and then we'll take a 10-minute break.
Perfect. So, this slide is going to be something you can try on your own during that 10-minute break. At the end of each month, Treasury assesses banking fees for each of your agency bank accounts. The fees for the current month are currently listed on the RStars teen screen as negative amounts that need to be reconciled. How would you record these agency expenses? Step 1, identify the transaction. Step 2, use the research tools to narrow down the possible T code options. And step 3, pick the T code that works best for your transaction. And step 4, make sure you have all the required coding and use the correct user class to make this entry. You will need OAM document 610 and to look up the GL account you need, OAM document 630 to look up the correct comp object, and the TC spreadsheet to look up the correct T code and user class. These are all in handout number 2, or you can click the links and shown on the screen. We'll resume at 9:15. And feel free to work on this entry on your own time during the break, or get up, get a cup of coffee. use the restroom. Once we get back, I will walk through this entry with you and see how y'all did. Thank you. Hmm. Hmm. Just as a quick reminder, we will be starting back up at 9:15. To those of you who are working on this problem, please send me a thumbs up reaction. All right, it is officially 9:15. How is everyone feeling? Hopefully, people have had a chance to work on this and try their best to solve it. Let's get into the thick of it. Uh, So, first off, what GLs and comp objects do we need to use? We will need to credit at GL0065 and debit GL3500 because this is a negative amount. Our unreconciled deposit will be a credit this time, and we won't be looking at revenues, we'll be looking at expenditures. The comp object will be E4600 because it's state government service charges. This seems like the best description for an expenditure I've seen for our state government so far, at least for the generic ones we're using. And so, from there, you'll need to find a T code that allows for GL0065, GL3500, and comp object 4 or 600 and is inactive status. So, filtering by all of that, we can see we've got 4 options for T codes. It's 137, 167, 172, and 8119. Reviewing these T codes on the 28A screen, we see that at TC 167 would be the best fit based on the description, and we see that at TC 172 and 819. He might be good fits, but we'll review screen 28B a little bit later. I want to bring your attention to T-code 167 because in the reverse field, it has an R, which means it is required to be reversed. So, while it says debit at 0065 and credit 3500, since it's required to be reversed, first it will always is debit 3500 and credit 0065, which is what we need. So looking at the 28B screens, we can see that TC67R is the best fit, as it is specifically recording treasury bank fees, which is what this is. While TC172R and 819R would work as well, as they have the same GL and comp object fit impact, they would not be the best fit, just as we've got an actual description to go along with our coding that works. Also, T codes in the 800 series are agency specific, so unless you who work for DHS, this T code is not going to work for you. We've determined that we want to record this with TC167R and comp object 4600. And now we just need to know the proper user classes, which you go into the user class tab, type in TC167 and filter it, and here's the list of user classes you can use. Not a long list, but always be sure to prepare what user classes you have access to with what the T code requires. And as a result of that entry, we have removed the negative unreconciled deposit balance and increased our expenditures, and the auto generation of 332R has done the rest. I have time to answer one or two questions. So, are there any questions from anyone? No, that was a lot to cover, and we went through it kind of fast. Well, pretty fast.
I don't see any questions, Scott. Thanks so much.
All right, then. And let's give it back to Liz Schultz. Take it away.
Thank you, Scott. So we've already gone through quite a bit of information this morning. We haven't gotten a lot of questions, but if you have questions, put them in the chat. We've got a couple more segments to cover with you today. We're still going to talk about accounts receivable. We're still going to have accounts payable, and we should have some time at the end for questions as well. We'll also have two more breaks in the middle of each section, kind of similar to what we did with the deposits. We'll give you an example. If you want to work through it, you can. So continue to ask your questions in the chat and let us know how we're going. If we need to speed up or slow down, or if you want some more information on examples, we're doing pretty good on time today. We've got the whole morning scheduled. So please, if you were hoping to get something out of this training and we haven't quite touched on it yet, please feel free to give us your feedback and we can adapt this so that you're definitely getting something out of it. So with that, I'm going to move to our next topic of accounts receivable. So for accounts receivable transactions, we're talking about those situations where you have outstanding amounts that are due to your agency. They haven't been received, but you want to record them in the accounting system. So there's a lot of different types of accounts receivable transactions. So we're going to go through our 4 steps. We're going to go through 4 examples of accounts receivable transactions in these slides. But generally, the first thing is to identify the type of receivable transaction you want to record. For this example, I've got a listing, the GL list, shown on this slide. This is all the GL account titles that contain the word receivable in the title. So there's, and also unreimbursed advances. So there's quite a few different options to choose from. You want to make sure you're recording the correct type. Is it taxes receivable? Is it loans receivable? Is it just general accounts receivable? We've got interest receivable. We've got current, non-current. There's lots of different types. So determining what type you want to record is going to help you find the right T code for that specific receivable. And you can look up all of these GL accounts in that OAM to get a definition of each so that you're making sure you're selecting the right one for the receivable that you're trying to record. Before we kind of start going through our examples, there's also some terminology related to accounts receivable I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of. When you're looking at the GL titles and when you're looking at the T code titles for accounts receivable, you'll see a couple different terms. One that I want to point out is a current receivable. This is most often what agencies are recording during the fiscal year. What this means in the accounting side is a current receivable is expected to be collected within 90 days of the end of the fiscal year for governmental funds, or if it's a proprietary type fund, within 1 year. Like I said, this is the most that agencies are typically recording during the fiscal year. So you'll see GLs with the title current or T codes with the title current in them. Non-current are those receivables that are longer term. They're not expected to be collected within 90 days of the end of the fiscal year for governmental funds, or within 1 year for the end of the fiscal year for proprietary type funds. So we do have some GLs and some T codes that are related to non-current receivables. Check with your agency on how you record that activity. There's a lot of agencies that will just make entries at the end of the fiscal year to kind of reclass between a current and non-current receivable, just to make sure everything's recorded correctly for the end of the fiscal year. So that's what those 2 terms mean, current and non-current, as it relates to receivables. We also have a couple terms, these 3 last ones, the last 3 bullets on this slide. These are specific R-stars terms that reference R-stars functionality. So when you see something that says build, what that means for R-stars is that these transactions are going to post to that document financial table, the R-stars 64 screen, to allow you to track all the activity related to the receivable. So you'll enter in the current document used to establish the receivable on the 64 screen, and you can see here's the outstanding amount for this invoice. Any subsequent transactions, if you have to adjust that invoice or if you're going to be doing a partial collection on that invoice, you're going to use that same invoice number that you used to originally establish the receivable as the reference document. And that just ties it in the system. So then you can go to the 64 screen and say, well, here's our receivable. We've received this much in payments, and this is the outstanding amount that's still due. So when you see GLs or T codes reference the word build, that means, is it going to show up on the R-stars 64 screen or not? Unbilled will mean it's not going to be on the 64 screen. So you can still record receivables in R-stars and just not have them tracked on the 64 screen. You don't have to use the reference document on subsequent entries. It really just depends what makes sense for your agency. A lot of people like to use the build just because it makes it easier to track and manage your ARs and track, do aging reports and see what's still outstanding. But there is flexibility in R-stars. So that's what those build versus unbilled terms mean. We also have the term invoice that you will see on different T code titles. And for R-stars, that term has a specific meaning. If you have a T code that includes the word invoice in the title, it indicates that this T code will attach to a separate entry screen in RStars when you're recording this, so you can be able to produce a system-generated invoice. So this is, again, optional functionality. If you want RStars to generate an invoice for you that you can then send out, you can use those T codes that have the word invoice on them. You know, some agencies, they're preparing their own invoices. They're not using T codes that will generate one. But that's what that means when you are looking at T codes, because you'll see some T codes are set up very, very similar, but the only difference might be one generates a system generated invoice and the other doesn't. We also have a specific accounts receivable tool. We're going to still go over all those same tools we've talked about, the GLs, the comp objects, the T-code spreadsheet list that we've mentioned earlier in this training. But there is one specific to receivables that you can find on our website. This is just kind of a decision process to help you determine what T-code would be appropriate for your entry. It'll ask you questions. Do you want this tracked on the RStar 64 screen or not? Do you want it to generate an invoice? And then it'll kind of point to which T codes you might want to look at for your entry. So we've got a link to that on the slide. It's in your handout number 2 as well. So that's another tool you can use to find T codes. Okay, so we're going to go through 4 examples. We've got the slide reference numbers on here if you want to look at those later, just to help you find that information. We're going to establish accounts receivable. We're going to adjust an accounts receivable. We're going to collect on an accounts receivable, and then we're going to show how you would adjust that collection entry. So example 1, to establish accounts receivable. So in this scenario, a program within your agency prepares and sends monthly invoices to collect funds from clients for various services that the program provides to the public. You're wanting to record these invoices in RStar so that you can track amounts that are owed and run aging reports. So we're going to do our step 1. We're going to identify the type of transaction we're going to record. We're going to identify the general ledger accounts we want to use and the comptroller object we want to use for this transaction. So let's look at the debit side. What GL accounts do we want to debit? And just a tip, if you're not sure what the normal balance for a specific GL account is, you know, is this GL account normally a debit balance? Is it normally a credit balance? You can actually look this information up on the D31 profile. You can enter that GL account number on the D31, and there's a field that's called the normal balance field to see if that GL normally contains a debit or credit balance. So that can be helpful. So for this example, this is general accounts receivable activity. So what our first step, we took a look at that GL OAM that has all the definitions of the different GLs. And looking through those descriptions and titles, we narrowed it down to 2 possible options. GL 0501 for accounts receivable other billed, or GL 0503 accounts receivable other unbilled. And if we look at those descriptions, they're almost exactly the same. The only difference between these 2 GLs is 0501 is going to post to the document financial table in RStars, so that's 64 screen. And 0503 will not. But other than that, the descriptions are exactly the same for these 2 GLs. If we want to look at the other side of the GL accounts, we want to credit for this transaction. In our example, these invoiced amounts are considered revenue for the program. So we're going to look at our revenue control GLs in the Oregon Accounting Manual GL list. We haven't received the cash. So we don't want to record it to GL 3100 because that's for cash revenue. We want to record it to 3101 because this is accrued revenue. It's due to us, but we don't have the cash yet. So we've got kind of an idea of what we're thinking about for the GL accounts for this entry. We also need to see what comp object we need to use. So in our example, we had the description that these amounts collected are charges for services. So we can go out to the OAM and look at all of our definitions for comptroller objects. And we can see there's quite a few different ones for charges for services. Looking at the right-hand side of the descriptions, they all have the same description: charges for services, all revenue received from individuals, businesses, other funds for services performed. So the only difference between these are really the title. So we're going to find the title that's the best match. So kind of looking through these, this one seems to this is just charges for services. It's not a central service charge. It's not related to indirect costs. I think this other charges for services seems to be the best fit. If you're ever looking through that comp object list and maybe there's a couple, the descriptions aren't really helping or the titles aren't really helping and you're not sure, the Oregon Accounting Manual is managed by SARS, the Statewide Accounting and Reporting Group. Each agency has a SARS analyst. They can help kind of answer that question. Reach out to others in your agency as well. They may be able to answer that question for you. But if your agency is still uncertain, SARS can help direct you to the right comp object to use so that everything's recorded correctly for financial reporting. So in this example, though, 0407 looks like what we want. It's other charges for services. So now we're ready to move to step 2 and find a T code. So after step 1, we determine we want to record a transaction that debits either GL 0501 or 0503 and credits GL 3101. We also want to use comp object 0407. GL 0501, 0503, they're both pretty much the same. It's just whether or not we want to track this on the 64 screen. In our example, we said we wanted to track amounts that are owed and run aging reports. So GL 0501 seems to be the better choice. It's easier to kind of track the cumulative activity on the invoice on the 64 screen. So we're going to look at GL 0501 for this example. If you could still use GL 0503, you would still have the same accounting impact and you just wouldn't have anything on the 64 screen. So it really depends on how your agency wants to track those receivables. So let's look at our T code spreadsheet again and see if we can find what T codes we could use for this transaction. So if we go in here, we put in our GL 0501, we put in our comp object 0407, and then we filter to just the values that show true for those two criteria. We have 10 different T codes. Now, we only allow you to search for one GL. We could have searched for GL 3101 and 0407 and done it that way as well. When you're actually doing this in practice, you might try both different GLs and see which T codes appear to help narrow down the list. So this is just one example. We're using 0501, but you could use the other GL account to search as well. So we completed step 2. We kind of started the process of finding what T codes may work. And now we're moving on to step 3 and trying to really find the best one in that smaller list for our transaction. So we can see these are active T codes. We can start looking at the GLs that debit and credit the items that we want. So, you can see there's some other GLs in here that maybe we don't want to impact, so we can throw those ones out. Also looking at the titles. The titles are really helpful for narrowing down the correct T code. So we can see we've got 3 different ones that talk about establishing an invoice, and that's what we want to do. We don't want to adjust it. We're not writing it off. We're not collecting it. So it looks like there might be 3 options we want to look at a little bit closer. T code 103 to establish an AR other billed, T code 193 and T code 199. So continuing on step 3, let's take a closer look at each of those on the 28A screen. We're going to kind of compare, see what the difference is between these. Looking at the titles, T code 103 at the top and T code 199 at the bottom, they're almost identical. The only difference is invoice or no invoice. So, do we want RStars to generate an invoice for these or not? Otherwise, those T codes are exactly the same. T-code 193, it has the same GL impacts, but the title doesn't quite seem what we're wanting to do. It's establishing a receivable, but it mentions grants, projects, CMIA, that's the Cash Management Improvement Act. It doesn't quite seem to fit, but we can take another look at the 28B screen to see if we can get more information in the description. We can also compare the edit indicators. They look pretty similar of what's required and what needs to be input. They're all going to require a comp object. So we can move to the 28B screen and see if we can figure out which one is really going to be the best one. So looking at this, focusing on those descriptions, we can kind of see T-code 103, T-code 199. Again, they have very similar descriptions. They're establishing an AR and accrued revenue. Looks like what we want to do in this case. T-code 193 says specifically it's used for grant, project, and CMIA system generated transactions. That's not what we want. That seems like something different, so we can throw that one out. So now we're deciding between T-code 103 or 199. In our example, it said that the program creates and sends the monthly invoices. So they have already done that work. So we don't need our stars to generate an invoice for these. So we can use the one that's no invoice, T-code 199 for this example. I mean, you could use T-code 103. It would record to everything you need in the system. It would just create an invoice that we don't need. So let's go to the next slide and move to step 4. So we found our T-code 199. And now we need to prepare our input entry. We want to make sure we have all the required coding, the correct user class. So we'll look at that T-code 199, the 28A and B screens, make sure we've got all the information that's needed. Per the 28A screen, for T-code 199, we'll need to enter a comp object, or if your agency uses agency objects, you can enter an agency object to look up that comp object. We need an appropriation or fund. Often those are just on the PCA, so you're not manually entering the appropriation fund, you're entering a PCA that's going to look up those fields. And then we also need a vendor number, vendor name and address. Some of those fields are going to be looked up by another field. So if you enter the vendor number on your transaction, it'll pull in the associated vendor name and address. T-code 199 also requires a field DUDT, which if you look on handout 1, we can see what that actually means is the due date. So we can enter a due date for this receivable. If we want this paid within 30 days, we can then use that later in reporting to run aging reports to see, how long has this invoice been outstanding? Is it 30 days past due, 60 days past due? So T-code 199 also requires that additional field. So once we have all the coding that we're going to need to make this entry, we're going to check our user class. So we'll go to our T-code spreadsheet. We'll go to that tab for user class, input T-code 199, filter our list to values that equal true. And we can see a bunch of different user classes here. We'll compare that against ones that we have, and we'll choose the right user class to make the entry. So looking at the end results for this example, these are going to be the general ledger balances after we enter this. We've established our accounts receivable with T-code 199. So at the end of it, we're going to have a $250 balance in GL 0501, a debit balance, and then we will have a credit balance in GL 3101, revenue accrued. So because we use GL 0501, the one that was billed, this invoice is also going to be on the 64 screen. So we've got an example of what that will look like as well. For this, we've got a made up agency, agency 101. Our document number that we recorded was AR 100-101. And we can see we've got the document balance of $250 in the middle of the screen there on the right. And we can see we have towards the bottom balance type 01, original amount 250. So we've only established the invoice. We haven't made any adjustments or collected on it yet. And I do see a quick question. Do most agencies use 103 or 199? There is variation. I think more of our agencies use 199. We don't have as many agencies use 103 to have the system generate the invoice, but it is an option, and we do have some agencies that use T-code 103. So if you're not sure, you can check what your agency uses. If you haven't used the invoice capability in the past, we've got more information on it in our data entry guide and some of the resources on our website. So if you're interested, reach out to your SFMS analyst and we can provide more information on that. So moving to example number 2, adjust accounts receivable. So kind of going along with our similar example, the program contacts us again about an invoice that we previously established. The program had to send out a revised invoice to the client as the original invoice incorrectly included a $25 charge for a service that was provided to another client. So now they're asking us to update the invoice that was established in example 1 to reduce the amount due. So we need to make an adjustment to this invoice to reduce it by $25. So let's go through our steps again. We're going to identify the type of transaction you want to record, what general ledger accounts, and what comptroller objects we want to use. Now, for this one, it's a little bit simpler. This is an adjustment to an existing invoice. So we're going to want to use the same GL accounts and comp objects as we did on the original entry to make this adjustment because we're wanting to reduce that invoice balance. So we're still going to use GL 0501 and GL 3101. We're going to want to credit GL 0501 and debit GL 3101 because we're reducing that invoice balance. And we're still going to use that same comp object that we did in our first example, the other charges for services 0407. So on our 64 screen, we want this invoice to show an amount due of $225 as the end result. So let's walk through how to do that. Sorry about that. Let me get to the right slide. Okay, so finding a T-code. So we've determined we want to record a transaction that credits GL 0501, debits GL 3101 to decrease the receivable amount, and we're going to use the same comp object. So we could go through those steps again of opening up the T-code spreadsheet and searching exactly like we did in the prior example. But there's a shortcut that we can use that I want to make sure you're aware of that's very helpful, especially for accounts receivable transactions. That description on the 28B has a lot of information, and sometimes it will reference other T-codes to use for entries. So if we go back and look at that T-code 199 that we used to establish this invoice originally, and we look at that description, it'll actually point us to the T-code we want to use to adjust it. It'll tell us we want to use T-code 107 to adjust this invoice. So that's just going to save us some time. Now we kind of know what T-code we should be using to adjust this. So we can look up T-code 107 on the 28A screen, just make sure it looks like what we want it to do. We can see the title of it, adjust accounts receivable, other billed. That sounds like what we want to do. We actually want to credit GL 0501 and debit 3101. But if I look at this T-code, it's set to debit 0501 and credit 3101. But we can use that reverse indicator. So if we look at that reverse field, it's blank, which means reversal is an option. So we could use this T-code 107 if we wanted to increase the invoice, or we could use a T-code 107R if we wanted to decrease the value of this invoice. Looking at some of the required fields, this T-code requires that we enter a reference document. So there's an indicator called RDoc. That means reference doc if you look at that page 1 handout that defines all of those. Because this activity is tracked on the 64 screen, when we make this entry, we need to enter the original invoice number, that AR 100-101, as the reference document. So all the activity can be summarized on the 64 screen. So that's looking good. If we look at the 28B screen, The description sounds like exactly what we want to do to adjust an accounts receivable established in the current year with T code 103 or 199. And this does post to the document financial table. So we've got our information, and we found this one pretty quick because of that description. So, if you're ever trying to adjust an entry, especially one that's on the 64 screen, I always recommend going back and looking at that T code you used to originally set it up, because it might have more information right in that description on what T codes you need to do that. Just can save you some time. So finally, step 4, when we need to make sure we have all the required coding, can look at the 28A and B and see what we need. Because we're adjusting an invoice, we're going to have very similar required fields to what we entered when we originally established this invoice. So we're going to pretty much use all the same coding elements from our original entry, but we need to make sure we're entering an R in the reverse field on the transaction entry screen to decrease the invoice amount. We're going to create a new document number for this entry, but make sure to enter the original receivable document as the reference document, just so it can tie everything on the 64 screen for us. And then we need to make sure we have the correct user class before we make the entry. We can search T code 107. It's going to have very similar results to T code 199. If you can establish an invoice, you probably have the security to adjust that invoice. But you can go through that step and just make sure that you have the user class for that entry. And then we can see the end results of our entry here. So we've established our accounts receivable previously in example 1. Now in example 2, we're adjusting it with 107R. And when we're done with that adjustment, now we show a debit balance in GL 0501 of $225 and a credit in revenue for $225. We can also look and see what this looks like on the 64 screen on the next slide. So we can see for our invoice, we enter in that original invoice number again, that AR 100-101. Now we see an updated document balance of $225. And towards the bottom of that screen, we see our original amount of $250, and then we also show an entry for an adjustment. So we can see all the history that we originally recorded this at $250, and then we adjust to reduce it by $25. All right. So we are at example 3. This is the next opportunity. If you want to try to go through this process on your own, we're going to take another break here. Let me just walk you through the example. So in this case, we're going to be collecting that accounts receivable. So in our scenario, the client paid the invoice in full, that $225 invoice, they've now paid it. So the program notified us that they received payment for this invoice number. We can see the deposit currently is listed on our RStars 13 screen, waiting to be reconciled. So how will you record this activity and clear the outstanding AR balance? Go through those 4 steps. We've got the links at the bottom. If you want to test that out and see, we'll come back and go over the answer. We are at 9:50 right now, so we're going to take 9:51 right now. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 10:01 a.m. Are at 10:01. Hopefully everybody had a chance to take a break, or if you wanted to go through the example, had some time to kind of walk through these steps. The next few slides we'll kind of go over. If you had the opportunity to go through, see if it matches your answer, or if you've got questions, let us know. So just revisiting our example, we are collecting the accounts receivable. So we set up that invoice, we adjusted it. Now we've received payment. We've got a deposit that's on the 13 screen waiting to be reconciled. So we need to record that deposit and clear our AR balance since that has been paid. So what GLs and comp objects do we want to use for this entry? For GLs, it's a collection of an existing invoice. So we're going to be using those same GL accounts we've used in the prior examples, 0501 and 3101. But we also want to recognize the cash that was received. So our original invoice, we're wanting to clear that. We want to credit GL 0501 and debit GL 3101 to clear those AR balances. We also have the deposit on the 13 screen, so waiting to be reconciled. So since it's waiting to be reconciled, we're going to want to debit GL 0065, and we need to credit revenue cash GL 3100. So there's a couple things we want to do with this entry. We still are going to be using the same comp object we used in the prior examples. This is still other charges for services, 0407. So we're going to use that for this entry as well. So looking at our T-code options, you could have gone through the T-code spreadsheet, done it that way. We're going to use that shortcut I mentioned of looking back at that T-code we used to originally establish the invoice, because there is some more information that will save us some time. So we set up that invoice with T-code 199. There's a sentence in there that we can use T-code 176 or T-code 730/731 to record collections. So now we've kind of narrowed down which T-codes we want to look at. So let's take a look at those T-codes. We pull those up on the 28A screen. You've got a lot of information on this slide. If we look at T-code 176, we can see it hits all of the GLs we're looking for. It's debiting 0065, crediting 0501, debiting 3101, and crediting 3100. So, you know, we can have up to 8 GLs on a single T-code. Most of you're usually going to see 2 or maybe 4. But in this case, we're going to be hitting 4 different GLs with this one entry. And if we look at the title for T-code 176, collection AR other billed, that seems like what we want to do. That T-code description on our prior slide also mentioned T-code 730 and 731 as an option. Looking at these, the titles don't seem quite right. Quasi-external expenditure, quasi-external revenue. These are balance T-codes. We aren't going over these balance transfer T-codes in today's basic training. We do plan on having a section on that in our advanced training in 2025. But these T-codes would really be used if we're having one state agency pay another state agency. So T-code 730 would be entered by the paying agency. They'd have an expenditure with GL 3500. They'd be reducing their cash with GL 070. And then on 731, that would be the receiving agency that would receive the cash and clear their AR balance. So we don't want to use 730, 731 for this example. This was an outside client. It's not another state agency. So T-code 176 looks like what we want to use to make this collection entry. If we want to look at the descriptions, we can get some more information on that. T-code 176, it talks about recording a deposit for an AR that was established with T-code 199. So we've got that information there. We have more information on T-code 730. It does say this T-code must be used with 731. Some more information in there, but you know, this isn't a payment from another agency. So it's not what we want to use for this example. So we can then use T-code 176 on the user class tab of the T-code spreadsheet to find out which user classes we can use to make that entry. There's some more options than what we had when we established the invoice. Cash receipts clerks, there's some additional user classes listed on here, but you just want to compare this against your own user class. You can use any of these user classes if you have them to make this entry. And then we have the end results of our entry. So we've got, when we established the accounts receivable, that was number one, example number one. When we adjusted it, example number two. For this example number three, we're collecting it with T-code 176. But there's also going to be a system generated entry because this is the deposit that's on the 13 screen. So when that deposit reconciles, it will move the cash from unreconciled deposit to GL0070, cash on deposit with treasurer. So once all that's been done, we've made our entry, the deposit is now reconciled on the 13 screen. The end result we'll have an increase in our cash balance, $225. We'll have cleared the balance in GL 0501. We don't have any amounts due for this invoice anymore. We'll show our credit balance for GL 3100 revenue as cash, and then we have cleared the revenue control accrued. It's no longer accrued. We actually have the cash now. And if we look at our 64 screen for this, we will see when we put in that original document number that our doc balance is now 0. We've got a couple of entries at the bottom that show that we've received a payment and that this AR has been paid. Now, for this example, T-code 176 worked great. It did everything that we needed. Potentially if the deposit was recorded and you just used a T-code 190, like we went through in the deposits, you recorded it to GL 0065 and 3100. You could record that cash that way, and then you could adjust the invoice with a T-code 107R to reduce it to 0. If we map that out, it'll have the same ending result for the GL balances. It's not really ideal because then on the 64 screen, you would just show that you adjust the balance for this invoice to 0. You wouldn't see that it was actually collected. But the important thing is to know there may be multiple ways to get to the same end result. And it's really about picking the best T-code for the situation. In this case, T-code 176 would be the best one, but it doesn't mean that there aren't other options to record things. So our final example on accounts receivable is to adjust a collection entry. This is still building on the prior examples we just went through. The program contacts us again about this invoice, AR 100-101, the one we just zeroed out. The payment that we previously recorded to clear this invoice, the program lets us know it was applied to the wrong invoice number. That payment was actually for invoice AR 100-104, and AR 100-101 is still outstanding. So now we need to go back and correct our prior entry to apply that payment against the correct invoice so that we can correctly track everything on the 64 screen and recognize that that AR 100-101 is still due. We actually received a payment for another invoice. So for this, same steps we've followed before, we're going to identify the type of transaction we want to record and look at the GLs and comp objects to use. So this is an adjustment to the collection entry we just made with T-code 176. Looking at our explanation of the example, the GLs and the comp objects on the entry were correct. We looked at both invoices. They have the same coding for this example. The only problem is we applied the payment to the wrong invoice. We should have made the entry with a different reference document number if we had all that information. So we need to back out the impacts of our T-code 176 entry and repost it with the correct invoice. So the question is, well, could we just do a T-code 176R to back it out and then repost it with the correct reference document invoice with T-code 176? And the answer to that is maybe. It really depends whether the deposit has already reconciled on the 13 screen. So if you remember back in the deposit section earlier today, whenever you're correcting a deposit entry, you should check to see if the deposit is already reconciled on the 13 screen, because this will determine whether the correcting entry needs to impact GL 0065 because it's still unreconciled, or GL 0070 because the deposit is already reconciled. So if this deposit was unreconciled, we pull it up on the 13 screen, it still has an end status, it hasn't matched to Treasury yet. We could correct it with a T-code 176R, back out that entry, repost it with T-code 176. And that would be the way we could resolve that one. But for this example, we're going to assume that deposit already reconciled. We already had the T-code 332 entry generate. So the cash is currently sitting in GL 0070. So we want to do a correction that's going to hit that GL instead of 0065. So let's take a look at that. We're going to research our tools to narrow down some T-code options. So let's start with our shortcut. Let's look at the T-code we used to establish the invoice. Let's look at the T-code we used to record the collection entry and just see if there's any information on what we would use to adjust. So we've got T-code 199, the description here. We've got T-code 176, the description here. There are some references to other T-codes, but reading through this, there's nothing that says what we would use to adjust that collection entry. So, you know, there's not always going to be all the information in the T-code description. It's a good place to start because it may save you some time. But in this case, we don't have any more information there. So we need to go look at the T-code spreadsheet and see what options exist. So we know we want to hit GL 0070 because that's where the cash is. We're going to still be using the same comp object, 0407. So we've got our spreadsheet, we've filtered it to only those values. We've filtered the status code. There was a lot of results, so we're going to look at the status code. We're only going to look at active T codes. We also know we want to hit the 64 screen. We have AR 100-101. Sure, it currently has an outstanding balance of 0, but we know that amount is still due, and we want to reduce the payment amount on a different invoice. So we can look at what other fields might help us narrow down this T-code list further so we're not having to go through each one. The ref document indicator. We know we want to enter a reference document because we want this activity on the 64 screen. So we have a filter in this example where we're only looking at T-codes that require or have an input necessary for reference documents to try to further narrow down our list to find what we need. So looking at our abbreviated list here after we added those filters, there's a few different T-codes that seem like an option. We have some T-codes that talk about in the title, moving revenue and cash. Looking at those, we have ones that say move revenue out, cash out, adjust AR. That kind of sounds like what we want to do, T-code 464 and 465. There's also some T-codes in the 700 series that look like they have the GL impacts that we're interested in, but these mention that quasi-external revenue, so they don't really seem like what we want. We've got a T-code 800. That's the title shows it's specific to DHS, so it's not what we want to use. Again, we're not really going into balance transfer transactions in today's training, but T-codes in the 400 series are usually used to move activity within an agency. So when you're doing correcting entries, a lot of times those are T-codes that start with 4 if you're just moving things within an agency. T-codes that are in the 700 series are moving things between agencies. So if you're trying to send money back and forth between two different agencies, those are the T-code 700 series. So let's take a closer look at T-code 464 and 465. If we look at the 28A screen for these T-codes, we can see the titles look like what we want to do. We can see these are balanced T-codes, so we are going to look at one example with a BT type T-code, even though we're not going into balance transfers in full in this training. If you want more information about that, please sign up for our advanced training. But balance transfer T-codes need to be entered together. So if we enter T-code 464, we also have to enter 465. The entries are always going to net to 0. We're just taking cash out of one bucket and putting it into another bucket. So it should net to 0 because it's just moving activity. We can also see on the 28A screen, if we look at the bottom, that both of these T-codes hit the document financial table, the 64 screen, which is what we want. So looking at the 28A, this is looking very promising. We look at the 28B screen, we can see the descriptions here. So they talk about adjusting an AR suffix to reclass ARs between various suffix numbers. So this description is talking about reclassing it between suffix. We want to reclass between AR documents. The description is similar to what we want to do. Just a note, the descriptions may not always be an exact match of what you're looking to do. The important thing is that you're hitting the right GLs and comp objects. These descriptions are just meant to help you understand how the T-code's intended to be used. If you've got questions on, is this description doesn't sound quite right, you can ask your SFMS analyst to kind of confirm if you could use that T-code for the entry you're trying to make. But this one looks like the one we want to use to correct this collection entry. So we go through our normal process of preparing our batch. So for T-code 464, this is the one that's backing out the impacts of that T-code 176 entry. So we're going to enter all the same fields that were on our original T-code 176 entry to back it out with T-code 464. T-code 465 is then going to repost the transaction. So we're going to enter the same information, but we're going to use the correct reference document. It was supposed to be a different invoice, so we need to enter that invoice on the T-code 465. Both of these T-codes will be entered in the same batch using the same BT document number, and the document amount is going to be 0 for a BT because it all nets to 0. So once we have the necessary coding to make the entry, we need to confirm our user class. We'll look up T-code 464, compare what user classes we have to what's allowed. You could also search by T-code 465. They're going to be the same results for that as well. So we can find our user class that we need for the entry. And then let's take a look at the end results of our entry. So 1 through 4 on the table there were our prior examples. Now we're trying to correct the payment. So in the table at the top in orange there, that's for invoice AR 100-101. We're going to be entering T-code 464 to reverse out the impacts of that entry. So once we post that T-code 464 for AR 100-101, we're going to restore our balance of $225 in GL 0501 for that invoice because it's still due. And we're going to restore that GL 3101 balance. Then we're going to be moving it to AR 100-104, the T-code 465 entry in the bottom in green there. We previously didn't show it in an example, but we established AR 100-104 with T-code 199 in the past. Now we're applying our payment with T-code 465 to that invoice, and then we can show that that invoice has been fully paid. We recognize the cash that we've received in GL 0070 and the revenue in GL 31. If we look at our 64 screens now, we can confirm after we posted that entry that we have restored the balance for AR 100-101. Now we still show it owes $225 is still owed. And then AR 100-104 has a doc balance of 0, and that liquidation and payment is now applied to that invoice. So that just confirms that the correcting entry did what we wanted it to do. We've restored our prior invoice and applied this payment to the correct invoice. So I think I answered one question in the chat, maybe. I'm not seeing any additional questions. Amber, did we have any other questions?
I have not seen any, no.
Okay. So then I am going to turn it over. We've got one more section here on accounts payable. And Scott is going to walk you through that, and we'll have one more break during that section.
Thank you, Lit. Because now that we learned how to receive revenue, let's learn how to send money out. So, which types of payables will you be using? The Oregon Accounting Manual lists many GL accounts associated with payables. For today, we will mainly focus on vouchers payable, or GL 1, 2, U11, and while it is the case that most voucher payable transactions will result in a physical warrant, a vendor can also be set up for direct deposit in SFMA. The content to follow will be applicable for both types of payment and processing, just so that no one has any confusion about how which type of payment to set up. So we got to go through some key points. First, checks are not warrants. Checks use suspense accounts at Treasury and require their check writing authority to issue. Warrants, however, use a recipiated account and are issued through R-stars. In a state of fiscal emergency, the state is not legally required to immediately redeem that. Those are rare. I don't know of any case where it's happened in Oregon, but just be aware of that difference. And second, for a T-code to generate a warrant, it must have a writing indicator of 1 on the 28A screen. We will be going over that a little bit later, and you will see some examples of that. Finally, VP transactions that generate a warrant will require a due date. A transaction with a future due date will remain on the 530 screen until that date is reached and the warrant is generated. In addition to needing vendor numbers and mail codes to generate a warrant, you will also need a payment distribution type, or PDT. Our quick links handout has a list of PDTs. These document that is in the accounts payable resources section. You are free to click on that and get some more detailed information. And the frequent types that you will be using with accounts payable, however, are MA, RA, and DA. These all combine transactions with the same agency and vendor mail code into one warrant, but they change where and possibly how the warrant is distributed. And MA mails the warrant directly to the vendor, RA returns the warrant to the agency, and DA processes an ACH payment into the warrant. And one thing to note is that transaction PDT overrides header PDT, and header PTD overrides the 51 screen in PDT. Therefore, or if you have a specific transaction that needs to be mailed out, but the rest of the batch needs to be returned to the agency, you can use the MA PDT for that one transaction and not have to worry about the rest. For examples today, we will be covering recording a voucher payable for an expenditure, a voucher payable to clear a deposit liability balance, and to correct coding used on a voucher or payable. Okay. So let's say your agency ordered some new business cards. You have the bill and the vendor is correctly set up in R-stars. How do we record an expenditure and have the system mail a warrant to the vendor? Our first step is, as always, identify the GL accounts that we need for the transaction and the controller object we need. Basically, what type of transaction do you want to record? Since this will be a voucher, we will need to credit GL 1211, and as this is an expenditure, we will need to debit GL 3501, expenditure control accrued. Once the payment is generated, the system will generate a payment liquidation entry. Need to update this to a cash expenditure instead, so we need to use accrued for right now. The comp object to use it's business cards, so we'll need to use 4200 office supplies. I just can't think of a better object than that for some business cards. For funding our T-code, finding our T-code, we'll need to debit GL 3501 and credit GL 1211 on using incomp object for 4200. And so get out your spreadsheets and let's do some digging. And once we filter by IGL and comp object using these filters for true, we see that we have 12 different T-codes to review. So let's look at our list and we see that T-code 837 had an inactive status, and many of the GL codes on this list also impact GLs that we don't want. So let's focus on those that only debit and credit at GL 3501 and GL 1211. Those are our T-code 221, 222, 682, 804, and 959. So let's pick the best T-code. Oh, we can look at the titles and we see that T-code 2201 is only to be used for specific RTI type transactions only. So let's skip over that one. And for now, T-code 682 is labeled as DAS as only. So unless you're a part of this agency, that's a no-go. T-code 804 has the debits and credits reversed from what we want to do. We could check if the T-code allows reversal, but as this T-code is specific to the 800 series and the AFS subsystem, it's only usable by IDHS, so let's avoid that one. And T-code 959 is specific to the ADPIC system, which we are not using at the moment. And therefore, based on titles alone, T-code 222 seems what we need. Voucher payable, not encumbered. But let's compare it with T-code 221 on the 28 screen, A screen. We see some differences in a few of the indicators, but the T-codes look extremely similar to each other. Let's pay a close attention to the warrant cancel TC field, the payment liquidation TC, and the payment redemption TC fields. While they all match each other, the reason why I want you to pay attention is that these fields determine which T-codes are automatically generated when this voucher will be stopped or canceled, liquidated, or redeemed. And this makes it very efficient and for conducting a stop payment or a general payment of these warrants, because we don't have to enter in a specific T-code for each of these different situations. The system will do it for us. Reviewing the 28B screen, we can see the description of this T-code. And just like it says as on the spreadsheet, T-code 221 is only to be used for recurring transactions and processed in night batch cycle. It's not what we want right now, especially when we're only buying business cards. So let's use T-code 222. So for making this entry, before moving on to the proper user class, we need to make sure the vendor number and mail code are correct, as well as entering the due date for this entry. If the mail codes do not match, then the warrant will not be fused together with other, and well, this entry will not be on the same warrant going out to the vendor. If the mail codes are different, it'll generate 2 different warrants, for one for each mail code. So, make sure you have the vendor number, make sure you have the mail code, and make sure you have that due date. Okay. So, final step, looking up the user class, enter 222 into the user class field to search for UC by TC, filter it by true, and you will see all the user classes that come up. As always, check these user classes against what you have and what you need for the transaction. At the end of the day, hey, once we process this, we can see the payment liquidation and going out and moving and removing the voucher payable, while also increasing in cash expenditure, or then a little bit later, where we will be seeing the payment redemption and decrease payments outstanding and payments offset, and decrease well, oh, sorry about that. Payment liquidation decreased cash on deposit, but payment and redemption will decrease these payment outstanding and payment offset at accounts. Note that payment redemption will not use a comp object because it's just decreasing the outstanding and offset accounts and not affecting our cash or expenditure control accounts. Oh, sorry about the misclick. So, we will be taking a 10-minute break. As this toolbox indicates, we will be arriving back here at 10:43. The next example I want to show you is your agency previously received a refundable deposit from client. You record the deposit as a deposit liability with TC 162 and the deposit reconciled on the 13 screen. You are now ready to return this deposit to the client. How will you process this payment in RStars to generate a warrant and clear the associated deposit liability? For this example, you will need the TC spreadsheet, the list of comptroller objects provided by the Oregon Accounting Manual, and the list of GL accounts provided by the Oregon Accounting Manual. All links are in the first section of your handout about general research tools and Oregon Accounting Manual chapters. We will meet back here at 10:43. we have about 4 minutes left in our break. To the people who are working on this example, could you please give me a thumbs up if things are going well? And with that, we are back to our presentation. I hope everyone had a good break and was able to stretch their legs or stretch their mind trying to solve this example. Oh, so something I believe I forgot to mention before is that we recorded this deposit with T-code 162. Ooh, so that makes things a bit easier in this example if you go from there. Or which GLs do we need to use? We want to use GL 1551 to clear the balance because it was recorded with the T-code 162, therefore, or we credit it using GL 1551. And as we are issuing a warrant, we need to use a voucher payable and credit GL 1211. For the comp object, since the original 162 entry didn't use them, we don't need comp objects right now. So which T-code do we use? We can go to 28B and see if there's a clue, which we see right here. To return deposit liability to depositor, use TC287. And then we look up TC287 on the 28 8A screen, and it debits its GL1551 and credits its 1211. So we'll need to enter a due date and a vendor number with this transaction. No OComp object is required, or the payment liquidation will be recorded with a T-code 3E69 as indicated in the payment liquidation TC field. We can look up the impacts of this T-code using the 28A screen at a later time. For now, let's use F6 to move over to the 28B screen. Based on this description, we can confirm this T-code is the best one for us. It sets up a voucher payable for return of deposit liability, not document supported. Seems like exactly what we need. We found this T-code quickly, but T-codes that require subsequent entries often include additional information in the description that can save you some time finding the correct entry. Occasionally, it's not going to be nearly as quick. Just remember to use your shortcuts when needed. And I guess it was kind of a trick question, and you could have just opened RStars to figure it out. All right, so we determined we need to use TC287. Evan, what UC do we use? Well, let's plug that into the spreadsheet and compare what user classes that you all have. I know a lot of you have TC17, so for the ones that don't, make sure to compare what other user classes you have, or contact the coworkers that have TC17 or TC20 or UC17 or UC20. And at the end of the day, we see that the unreconciled deposit, it was removed using the original 332 entry, our 287 entry. He created a vouchers payable and removed the deposit liability. Payment liquidation removed the vouchers payable. And payment redemption got rid of the payment outstanding and payment offset GLs that the payment liquidation created. So, as such, you've accomplished a lot with only one T-code entry. For our final example, today we will be correcting the coding on previously recorded vouchers payable. And this is the thing with the business cards. We had the correct amount and the correct vendor, but we didn't have the correct PCA. So this next example will be teaching you how to fix that, which general ledgers to use to fix that. So the original example was recorded using TC222, which credited GL1211 and debited GL3501. Our initial reaction would be, why don't we reverse out transaction code 222 since it was the initial one? But we had a system generated entry of transaction code 380 that cleared the impacts of our voucher payable entry. So, it credited cash and debited cash expenditure, which means these are the GLs we want to correct, 0070 and 3500. And it'd be an issue if we just looked at the entry that we made ourselves and say, that's the one we want to correct without figuring out if there were any other system generated entries. And since the original entry used comp object 4200, that's the one we'll be using for this PCA correcting entry. So let's find a T code. We need to correct GL L0070 and GL L3500. And to do that, we'll need to make a debit to 0070 and a credit to 3500, and using comp object act 4200. At this point, I think we are all aware here of the process for using the spreadsheet. You plug in the GL you want, plug in the comp object, filter by T codes that allow these objects, and filter by status code. The unfortunate thing about GL L0070 is that there are a lot of T codes to choose from, 27 to be exact, even after all that filtering that we did. So pick the T code that best fits the transaction, but since this is a very common transaction, let's save some time and use this tip. For correcting previously recorded expenditures, use T codes 415 and 416 in a balanced transaction, and moving expenditures and cash in and out of funds. And we look them up on the 28A screen and confirm that at T code 415 and T code 416, and use the other one in a balanced transfer. And these BTT codes are entered together in a batch, the document amount will always net to 0. So be careful and make sure that you know that you're not adding the document amounts together for these two. You will be netting it to 0. Next, we look it up on the 28B screen. And these descriptions match what we're looking to do for the correcting entry. They have the correcting coding on our books for payment, but will have no impact to the payment that was already sent out to the vendor. It looks exactly like what we want. So what do we do next? Before we move to user class, here are a couple of notes. TC 416 will back out the impact of both the 222 and 380 entries. 380 entries. Make sure to enter TC 416 with the same coding as TC 222. 415, on the other hand, will repost the expenditure with the correct coding and use the correct PCA on this entry. We recommend entering TC 416 to back out the activity first just so that everything's neutral before or moving to make that PCA correcting entry. Next, let's look up the user class, input the TC into the search field, sort by true for TC allowed. I'll compare user classes that you need versus what you have. And lo and behold, the end result of our entry. Notice for TC15, we canceled out the payments outstanding and payment and offset, but for our TC416, no activity has changed in these account balances. This is solely an entry. These are solely entries to move move to correct a prior entry and move it into the correct PCA or the correct fund. They will not change any of these GL accounts. Questions, everyone? I know, this has been a lot, but we are finally nearing the end of our presentation. And Amber, do you happen to have any questions for me on that section so far?
I have not gotten any questions. Are there any out there for Scott?
And I'm not seeing any. We're actually quite a bit under on our timing for today's training. We had set aside 4 hours. If we don't have any questions, we can wrap up early, but we want to make sure that the people attending are getting the information they need. So if you do have follow-up questions, or if there is an example that we didn't talk about on the slides that you would like us to talk about, we are happy to do so. We do have time. So we want you to find this training useful. So just please give us feedback and let us know.
Mm-hmm. Or feedback if this training was moving a bit too fast for everyone. I mean we're ending an hour early. But I think, we did.
Okay.
So we have some questions.
We've got a couple. So I see the question of, can we go over balance transfers? And we are planning on having in our advanced training more information about balance transfers. We did cover a couple today for correcting entries. So when we talk about BTs or balance transfer transactions, there's kind of 2 different types. And again, we'll go over this more in the advanced training, but just since we've got some time. I mentioned earlier, T codes in the 400 series of T codes are for moving things within an agency. So balance transfers, they're always going to net to 0 because we're just taking activity and moving it from one place to another. So if you're trying to move something, between different GLs or between D23 funds or PCAs within your agency, balance T codes in the 400 series are what you want to look at. The most common ones we're seeing agencies use, and it wasn't that important tip, was T code 415 and 416 are most commonly what you use if you need to correct an expense. We went over the example of changing a PCA, if you needed to change an agency object or comp object, if you needed to apply it to a specific project number. Those are very, very common ones. For revenue, if you need to correct a deposit and it's already reconciled on the 13th screen, you need to move it to a different PCA or fund, you need to correct the object. T codes 407 and 408 will do that. We also have T codes in that series for transfers. We haven't talked about transfers today, but that would be GL 3150 and GL 3550, transfers in and out. So there's T codes in the 400 series to do that if you need to transfer cash between funds. There's a lot of information in the Oregon Accounting Manual about transfers in Chapter 15 that we'll go over in that future training. The other piece with balance transfers is the 700 series of T codes to move activity between agencies. So if you're paying another state agency that uses R-stars, we don't recommend that you issue a warrant to the other agency. That just increases this cost for the state. We have to print the warrants, we have to send them. We can actually do a balance transfer between agencies to recognize that movement of cash. So those are typically going to be in the 700 series. The thing with those T codes that tends to be special, you have to have a special user class to use those T codes across agencies. User class 48 is the most common for that one. And you're going to be, the agency that's recording the balance transfer is actually going to enter both sides. They're going to enter, if they're the paying agency, you're paying another agency, you're going to make an entry to recognize the payment on your side. It could be an expenditure, depending on the type of activity, or it could be a transfer. You would record your transaction, and then on the other side of that balance transfer transaction, you're going to be using the other agency's coding, because all BTs have to net to zero. So you're making an entry for your agency and for the other agency in that BT. So we have a list on our website of BT contacts. When you're moving money between two different state agencies, if you're getting an invoice or something, they should typically, those invoices will indicate what coding you need to use on your entry to pay that. We do have a list on our website of BT contacts for each agency. So if you know you need to move money and you're not sure what coding to use or what T codes might need to be used, you can contact that other agency and clarify that information. There's, different ins and outs with BTs. They get a little bit more complicated when we're talking about statewide balancing and the G38 codes that we'll go over in the future training. But the key thing to remember with balance transfers is they're always going to net to zero, and there's always going to be two entries. And they need to be entered in the same batch. And Angelica, that was kind of a brief summary. If there's anything specific with BTs you'd like to talk about today, let me know, or future input of something, an example you'd like to see in our advanced training, we can make sure and include that in there. The other question I see from Randall is, why are you recommending entering T code 416 to back out the activity first? That's a great question. A lot of the times it doesn't make much of a difference which one you enter first, 415 or 416. SFMS typically recommends entering 416 first to back it out, because sometimes agencies may run into cash or budget issues if they don't record it in the correct order. So let's say you have an expenditure, you need to correct it from one object code to another. T code 415 is going to record another expenditure. And if you don't have much budget or cash, you're going to get a system error saying insufficient budget, insufficient cash. But if you enter that T code 416 first, that'll remove the cash and budget from that prior expenditure and allow you to repost it with the T code 415. So it doesn't always make a difference. But if an agency is running into errors, or they know they have low cash or budget balances, low budget balances tends to be a concern at the end of a biennium, we recommend doing the T code 416 entry first to kind of circumvent those issues. Great questions. So on this slide, we do have links to various tools and resources. If you've got more questions, put them on there. We can definitely hang on. But if not, we can wrap up early, and you can reach out to us if questions come to mind later. So I'll turn it over to Justin.
Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you, Liz and Scott, for presenting all of this great T code information, and for Amber running the training session here. And thank you all for participating in the training and learning all there is to learn about T codes. I am going to put a survey in the chat. And so if you could take a moment, go ahead and fill out the survey regarding this training and what we did good or could improve upon for future instances. And then, as always, or not as always, but like Liz mentioned, we are doing an advanced training for T codes, and that'll go over some capital asset stuff and balance transfers. So be on the lookout for that coming soon. So thank you all again for participating and coming, and everyone have a great day.